Hello and most welcome to 957 of the Age series. I hope this will catch up. I think the microphone is in good condition, and why not continue with logs and how they nest. Let's see here. What's this? Nesting, I continue on page 140 in chapter 7, nesting versus global and local perspectives. Denesting often occurs spontaneously, as was the case with the police officer in chapter 1 who experienced a slowing down of time. It can also, oddly enough, be trained, as in deep meditation, when we rid ourselves of all context and focus only on one lot, say a mantra. Context can suddenly appear or vanish, but can also vary by degrees. For instance, when luminance is slightly reduced or enhanced. Surprisingly, the amount of contrast we perceive also determines the speed at which we perceive embedded objects. Stuart Anstis has shown that moving objects appear to slow down when they enter a low contrast movement environment. This would explain why we misjudge our own speed or that of other cars in fog. Anstis explains such misjudgment with the fact that when objects are in low contrast, as they are in fog, they appear to move more slowly. In a fog, other cars are reduced in contrast, so they appear to be going more slowly than they really are. Also, a driver judges his own speed largely by visual cues from the landscape as it slides past him, often viewed through the side windows of the car in peripheral vision. Fog reduces the contrast of the passing landscape, so it appears to slip by him very slowly, and he believes that he himself is driving slowly. In an experiment, Anstis has shown that apparent speed varies with contrast. He moved two squares, one light and one dark grey, at constant speed over a background of vertical stripes. The squares were slightly wider than the stripes, so the front and back edges always covered the same background color, a white or a black strip. Anstis observed that the two squares seemed to stop and start in alternation, like a pair of walking feet, a perceptual distortion he called the Footstep Illusion. Cite from his book by Anstis. When the dark grey square lay on white stripes, it had high contrast, dark versus white, and appeared to speed up momentarily. When it lay on black stripes, it had low contrast. Dark versus black, and it appeared to slow down. The opposite was true for light grey squares. Here we can see the thing in action. And this is called the Footstep Illusion, and it's reprinted from S. Anstis. Moving objects appear to slow down at low contrast. And this is from Neural Networks, page 16 in 2003. The temporal distortion arose from the change in contrast of the embedding background and the nested square. Unlike the still embedding and nested disks in Dakin's experiment with schizophrenics, see chapter 3, the simultaneous contrast in Anstey's experiments was changing at a continuous rate. So the temporal illusion of an embedded object speeding up or slowing down was brought about by changing simultaneous context. To be precise, it was the difference in luminance between dark gray and light gray which increased or reduced the simultaneous contrast between nested and embedded objects. Had both grays been of the same scale, the embedded object would obviously have become invisible. Just like a grey car in a very dense fog. However, as soon as there is enough contrast for us to perceive the difference that makes a difference, isn't that taken from Derrida directly? It is quite wondrous. Bateson's famous definition of information comes here in citation marks. A change from a higher to a lower contrast will result in a partial decontextualization. Vice versa, the change from a lower contrast to a higher one leads to partial contextualization. Our fractal temporal perspective thus changes with the degree to which a background is modified. We interpret an embedded object as nested only if the simultaneous contrast is strong enough to make a difference to us. In other words, no delta T depth can be generated if there is no perceived difference between the nested lots, as in the case when we try to make out the grey car in fog. Anstey's experiment shows that a higher contrast generates more context, which result in more simultaneous LODs, which in turn speeds up objects nested in that context. Vice versa, a low contrast creates less context, fewer simultaneous LODs, and slows down embedded objects. That is to say, a reduction of delta T depth slows down time, an increase in delta T depth speeds it up. This interpretation is consistent with the subjective distortions of duration I described earlier. A reduction of delta T depth can be achieved by ridding ourselves of context like unwanted onion peels, or by reducing the degree of contrast. It may also be obtained by directing our attention to one LOD only. The focus of attention may be shifted to a nested object or to an embedding context in the shape of a global structure. We tend to group visual percept, such as the motion of individual dots, possibly in the order to lower the level of complexity of the moving image. Such decomplexification would very likely to be selection effect, as it allows us to navigate the world faster and to keep track of meaningful assembles rather than getting lost in insignificant detail. However, we have seen in chapter 3 it can also be an advantage to see trees instead of the forest, as it enables us to compare and match patterns without experience an unwelcome simultaneous contrast which distort our perception of the nested structure. In a separate experiment, Anstey has shown that when we look at 4 pairs of dots which rotate at constant speed, i.e. 1 rev through second around the pair centers, we first perceive the local motions that is the clockwise rotation of each pair. But soon we perceive two global structures instead of the pairs of the dots. Two overlapping squares appear, which slide over each other. See Fig 7.2. We shift our visual focus. We start out with a local perspective once again. The display tended to flip back and forth over time between local and global motion, although the physical display never alters. In other words, the ambiguity in this display lay not in the motions themselves, but in perceptible groupings or solutions that the visual system adapted to the binding problem. And this points out that global and local are perspective. I can see it here. Global and local perspectives are incompatible solutions to the binding problems because it's not possible to see both movements simultaneously. He suggests that the local motion is pre-attentive and global motion is attentive. I think you can clearly here understand that difference is all there is. And by understanding that, we understand that there is much more to the world than we thought previously. It's actually an incredibly hard reduction to think about the world as consisting of material or essences, particles or anything like that. For me, that destroys the intricacy of difference. Bringing back in these intricacies is what fractality is doing, bringing back the real world. Anstitz points out that global and local perspectives are incompatible solutions to dividing problems, because it's not possible to see both movements simultaneously. He suggests that the local motion is pre-attentive and global motion is attentive. The very same experiment was further examined and extended by Peter Kohler et al., who discovered that when our perspective changes from local to global, the global configuration appears to move more slowly than the local one. To experience the phenomenon, I recommend visiting Kohler's animation, which can be accessed online. Although numerous attempts have been made to explain why we perceive the global motion percepts as moving more than the local ones, Kohler states that it remains unclear. When we look at two revolving squares rather than four pairs of dots, we reduce the complexity of percepts because we form a gestalt and simplify the world by shifting from a local to a global perspective. It is, however, important to keep in mind that on a cognitive level, global and local perspectives are temporarily incompatible. In other words, we see either the forest or the trees. When we look at the two revolving squares rather than the four pairs of dots, we reduce the level of complexity of the percept, because we form a gestalt and simplify the world by shifting from a local to a global perspective. It is important to keep in mind that on a cognitive level, global and local perspectives are temporally incompatible. In other words, we see either the forests or the trees, but never simultaneously. However, from the embodied point of view, it is quite possible to envisage multi-nested lots existing simultaneously in one observer participant's perspective. Nested structures display their embedded LUDs simultaneously, which means that delta T depth increases with every nesting. We can perceive stimuli simultaneous on many LUDs, be they cross-modal, such as the perception of sound, vision and touch, which we merge into one meaning-filled perceptual gestalt, or within one sensory modality, as when we listen to an orchestra and combine the individual auditory stimuli into a harmonious whole. Such a rich generation of delta T depth is not possible when we are forced to make a choice on the cognitive level. Our attention drifts to only one lot, be it the local or the global one. It shows that in a narrow perspective, when we are for stress, we tend to go into the either or situation, and it's a simplification. It's important to understand that this simplification actually is more or less classical physics. To simplify and being stress is the same manner, and having a linear time is stressful, but it could also be said that thinking of linear times as the effect of stress do create linear time. Stress never creates anything but linear time. So we understand that stress in some ways is a Western perception. It doesn't exist in other cultures. We have this special trait which combines with all other traits. Nothing is separable, and it's something I mentioned earlier. You cannot choose one part of the Burmese nation and say, this is I understand, the rest I don't. It's not for you to make that absurd choice. It is just an emotional, subjective, childlike gesture. A little bit like Augustinus pointing at something and saying, this is how you learn a tree is a tree. Not including the pointing gesture and that incredible complexion that is to point. I would not exaggerate to say, even to be able to point and understand that that means I point towards that would be a complexity that is, take a computation of the Eiffel Tower. It's completely ludicrous, and we often get these things, especially from Western philosophers that don't understand the endogenous and therefore don't understand the exogenous, and you have a lower level and you get this very firm sense of reality. And this is one of the traits of the lower levels. You're always in reality, you constantly confirm it. And as Augebor said, when reality feels real, you're not in it, because reality has no feel of reality to it. It doesn't have any taste or any like this is the real, and you never in a better situation figure out whether what happened yesterday or what will happen tomorrow in a sequencing, because that distorts everything. Then you have already left proper projecting, which is a forceful, not made upon things that had already passed. It's a creative process. You make up something completely new, and if in your head you get some idea of what has passed, you are already gone. You're already deep into a lower level complexity level that can only be called either metaphysics of presence or logocentrism. It is important also to keep in mind that on a cognitive level, global and local perspectives are temporally incompatible. However, we do not interact with the world on a cognitive level only. Our minds are embodied and we interact with our context via sensory channels simultaneously. Our fractal physiology allows both for vertical communication within our bodies, that is to say, when we integrate rhythms or fluctuations across levels and time scales, and for multi-level interaction with our environment. Our nested rhythms can entrain with their context on a number of lods simultaneously. Thus, our bodies have no problem reconciling a global with a local perspective, and actually experience both simultaneously. We may be entrained to our circadian rhythm, which is a safe time setter that regulates our sleep and wake cycles with all associated changes in, for example, body temperature and metabolism, and at the same time lock into meditation stimulation at 10 Hz. This, though, may trigger a panic attack, because the reason for this, in parenthesis, because 10 Hz stimuli often produce 30 Hz brainwaves. Simultaneous nested stimuli, be they in one sensory mode, as when we listen to an orchestra, or a cross-modal when we hear, see and smell a firework display with musical accompaniment. Multi-level entrainment is our primary mode of interaction with the world. A limitation exists only on a cognitive level, when we have to make a choice between the forests and the tree. There you saw an artist's impression of a reconciled global and local perspective. The notion of global and local perception are related to the cognitive styles of field dependency and field independency, which American psychologist Herman Witkin developed in the 1950s. In a nutshell, field independent people see the forest, while field-dependent ones see the trees. This second group has difficulty identifying embedded shapes in the background. Embedded shapes if there is little contrast between the nested objects and the embedding background. They also blend in better and work in teams more easily, whereas field-independent individuals effortlessly identify nestings and tend to make decisions alone. There appears to be an at least indirect correlation between a person's cognitive style and his ability or willingness to identify and set boundaries between nested objects and their embedding context, or between self and non-self. Thus, we might encounter strong field dependency in the boundary syndrome, when individuals fear losing or fusing, or in the meditating monk who is at one with the universe in a state of total immersion, and for whom boundaries are dissolved. In contrast to the global-local distinction, field independence and field dependence imply nesting, as the individual either embeds himself into the context or denests, that is to say, isolates himself from his environment in order to fully develop his potential. As speeding up or slowing down in time has often been correlated with moods. Time flies when we are happy and drags when we are sad. This correlation may possibly also be described by an increase or reduction of delta T depth. We may look here at an experiment conducted by Emily Pronin and Daniel Wegner, which show that thought speed influences moods. The experiment revealed that fast reading improved people's moods, irrespective of positive or negative content. Moreover, when people felt they were reading fast, they also reported feelings of power and creativity, a heightened sense of energy and inflated self-esteem, which are often associated with mania. Pronin and Wegner looked at the effects not only of fast, but also of slow thinking. Here is a cite from their script. If accelerated thinking leads to experiences associated with mania, might decelerated thinking lead to experience of depression? A brief examination of the criteria for depressive episodes supports the idea of a link between depression and decelerated thinking. Where racing thoughts are a criterion for diagnosis, a manic episode, diminished ability to think, is a criterion for depressive episodes. The result of our experiment suggests that the intriguing possibility that even during moments when we feel stuck, having depressed thoughts, intervention that accelerates the speed of such thoughts may serve to boost feelings of positive effect and energy. End of quote. Although participants were reading aloud statements which appeared by letter, they were able to integrate the individual words into a semantically meaningful whole. And this is why it's so important to get fractal. You won't understand the details, neither will you understand the whole if you're not fractal enough. Fractality takes training, because we are not born fractal, and we are raised in an environment that defies fractality, actually tries to deliberately get rid of it. And this is also the apparent, the fear for knowledge, which so much influences our culture, where every move we do or every intention we do is something to evade knowing, evade understanding. We live in the epoch, the era of non-understanding. It seems to be the measure for something that is successful is when you don't know anything, or at least you have lost some knowledge, which is extremely common today, that the losing of the knowledge is something that you prize as something being good with the educational system, and you get very proud when you sort of can level up everything you do, as in the example of the chess school. The more you think that it's enough to go to the last class, the more you are into this classic mood of thinking that knowledge in itself is an evil, something bad, and so sort of an absence. And Derrida would agree that the common movement today, the flux that goes underneath all societal action, thinking, discussion, its impetus is to dissolve, get rid of knowledge, to not understand anything more, to take away awareness itself. The now, with a little n, is the now of the metaphysics of presence, and its impetus is dissolvement of the awareness, taking away of the self, auto-destruction. Like Spengler wrote, we are going into a mechanical area where depression is the only option. And he was so right in the 20s. You see, everything is getting to more darkness, and we are getting there intentionally. We want that. This is the desired state to be in. This is more real. This is randomness. This is determinism. This is one being out of one's own picture, and this we're trying to convince others to join in on this. And it's also the killing off of science. Really recommend Gay Science, that shows that knowledge is an impossibility in the new world. So all those who thinks that Nietzsche is only attacking morality in a very good way, attacking God, is also attacking science, because the very foundations for knowledge is gone in the modern era. So we can only delegate our knowing to the experts, and not even they can know directly, because everything is via something, everything is forehand, and forehand in some way means not knowing, although it is something we do at some times when it's necessary to carefully look into something, maybe doing something segregated for a specific purpose. But the generalized idea of forehand is getting rid of knowledge, getting rid of understanding, getting rid of awareness as such. This is the driving force behind metaphysics of presence. And that is necessary until we understand fractality. There's no other way to go than the eradication of the ego, or the self, I would say, an awareness. Fractality is the only thing that can sort of, with knowledge, because it's only knowledge, and it's not any knowledge, need it be specific knowledge, and it was created now. History is completely unique, and it could also be the case it was never created. So this idea of generalized knowledge is in itself a tryout to get rid of knowing. Generalized knowing is blocking our knowledge. I think it's getting late here, and I'm getting mosquito stung. I say thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a very good night. Bye bye.